Welcome. Tonight we open a collection of accounts from ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, seated at desks, standing in hallways, holding pencils over answer sheets they never asked to receive. These are stories of tests, not the kind you study for, but the kind that study you. Settle in now. Get comfortable. And whatever you do, try not to think too hard about the correct answer. The elevator descended past the lobby, past the parking garage, past any floor that appeared on the building's public directory. Marcus Chen watched the numbers count down on the brushed steel panel. 3, 2, 1, then a symbol he didn't recognize, something like a zero that had been crossed out and written over. He had arrived at Aldrich & Associates at precisely 2 o'clock for what he understood to be a final interview. The position was Senior Data Analyst, the salary generous, the benefits comprehensive. Everything about the opportunity had seemed straightforward when he'd applied 3 weeks ago. The recruiter had been pleasant on the phone. The preliminary screening had gone well. His references had been contacted and had given, he assumed, favorable impressions. Now the elevator doors opened onto a corridor lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed at a frequency just below comfortable hearing. The walls were painted the color of old teeth, and the floor tiles bore the scuffs and scratches of decades of foot traffic, though Marcus could see no one else in either direction. A woman waited for him at the end of the hall. She wore a gray blazer and held a clipboard against her chest. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Mr. Chen," she said, "thank you for coming. Please follow me." She led him past numbered doors, not sequential numbers he noticed, but seemingly random. 47, then 12, then a door marked only with a dash. The woman stopped at a door labeled with what appeared to be his own social security number, though surely that was coincidence. Surely he was misremembering those 9 digits that had followed him his entire adult life. The room beyond was small and windowless. A single desk sat in the center beneath a circular fluorescent fixture. On the desk lay a pencil, freshly sharpened, and a booklet with a plain blue cover. "You have 90 minutes to complete the assessment," the woman said. "Please answer all questions thoroughly and honestly. Your responses will be evaluated for accuracy." "I thought this was an interview," Marcus said. "I prepared talking points about my experience, my qualifications. This is part of our standard evaluation process." The woman gestured toward the chair. "Please begin when you're ready. I'll return when time has expired." The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded permanent. Marcus sat. The chair was uncomfortable in a precise way, as though it had been engineered to prevent relaxation. The clock on the wall read 2:15, and he watched the second hand tick forward in its steady circuit before opening the booklet. The first page contained only instructions. Answer each question completely. Do not skip ahead. Do not leave any question blank. Your honest responses are appreciated and required. He turned to the first question. Describe the nightmare you had on the night of your 7th birthday. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had never told anyone about that nightmare, the one where his childhood home had filled with dark water that tasted like copper, where his mother's voice had called to him from somewhere beneath the surface. He had woken screaming that night, and his parents had comforted him, and he had never spoken of it again. He looked up at the clock. 2:16. The second hand moved backward for a single tick, then resumed its forward motion as though nothing had happened. His pencil touched the paper. He wrote. The second question asked about the lie he had told his college roommate about where he'd been the night of November 12, 2009. The third asked him to explain why he had really left his position at Mercer and Hollis, not the reason he gave in interviews, but the actual reason. The fourth asked about a conversation he'd had with his sister 3 years ago, one conducted entirely in the privacy of his own kitchen, reproducing his exact words with blanks for him to fill in. By the 20th question, Marcus's hand was trembling. By the 30th, he had begun to sweat, despite the room's aggressive air conditioning. The questions knew things about him that he had never written down, never spoken aloud, never confided to another living soul. They knew the password to his personal email. They knew the name he called himself in his darkest moments. They knew about the time he had almost done something terrible, and they asked him to describe what had stopped him. He answered. He didn't know why he answered, except that the instructions had said his responses were required, and something about this place, this room, this humming light, made him believe that requirement was not optional. Question 47 asked, "In approximately 15 minutes, you will stand and approach the door. Describe what you expect to find on the other side." Marcus checked the clock. 2:43. He had been here for nearly half an hour. He wrote that he expected to find the corridor, the woman with the clipboard, perhaps an explanation. Question 48. "You are incorrect. Revise your answer." The same question, repeated, waiting for a different response. Marcus crossed out what he had written and tried again. He expected to find something wrong. Something changed. He expected the corridor to be longer, or the woman to be different, or the doors to have multiplied. Question 49. Correct. Continue. The questions proceeded. They asked what he would say when he tried to call his wife and found her number disconnected. They asked how he would react when he reached his car and discovered it had been towed, though he had parked legally, though the meter had hours remaining. They asked about the route he would take walking home, and they knew about the shortcut through Morrison Park, the one he always took after dark even though the lighting was poor and the path was isolated. They knew what time sunset was tonight. They knew it would rain. Question 73. "You will stop walking at the bench near the old oak tree. Why?" Marcus wrote that he didn't know, that he had no reason to stop there, that he would continue home without pausing. Question 74. "You are incorrect. Consider your answer more carefully. You will stop at the bench near the old oak tree. Something will compel you. What is it?" He thought about that bench. He had passed it hundreds of times over the years he'd lived in this city. It was just a bench. Green paint, iron frame, wooden slats worn smooth by decades of use. There was nothing special about it. There was nothing, he remembered. Or perhaps the question made him remember. He had proposed to his wife on that bench, 8 years ago, on an autumn evening when the oak leaves had been falling like slow fire around them. He had proposed, and she had said yes, and they had sat there together as the sun went down, and he had thought that this was the happiest he would ever be. He wrote this down. The pencil scratched against paper in the too quiet room. Question 75 was the final question. It took up an entire page, printed in slightly larger type than the others, and Marcus read it 3 times before its meaning fully settled into his mind. Describe, in detail, how you will die tonight. The clock read 3:44. He had been here for nearly 2 hours, though the assessment was supposed to take 90 minutes. The second hand was moving backward now, had been moving backward for some time, and the fluorescent light above him had begun to flicker at the edges of his vision. Marcus thought about leaving the question blank. He thought about standing up and walking out, finding the elevator, returning to the surface, calling his wife, driving home, forgetting any of this had ever happened. But the instructions had said not to leave any question blank. The instructions had said his responses were required. He began to write. He described walking home through Morrison Park. He described stopping at the bench, compelled by memory, by sentiment, by something he couldn't name. He described the rain beginning to fall, the evening light fading, the strange quality of the shadows beneath the old oak tree. He described looking up and seeing something there, something waiting, something that had perhaps always been waiting. He described the last thing he would ever see. When he finished writing, the door opened. The woman stood in the threshold, her clipboard now holding his completed booklet, though he had not seen her take it. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Chen," she said. "We'll be in touch." The elevator rose. The lobby was empty. Outside, the afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward evening, and the clouds on the horizon promised rain. Marcus Chen walked toward the parking garage, already knowing what he would find, already knowing the route he would take, already knowing the bench and the oak tree and the thing that waited in the gathering dark. His assessment had been thorough. His responses had been accurate. The position, it seemed, had been filled. The morning fog hung low over Millbrook, the kind of thick gray blanket that softens the edges of the world and makes familiar roads feel like passages into somewhere else entirely. Emily Thorne sat in the waiting area of the Department of Motor Vehicles, her learner's permit clutched in hands that wouldn't stop trembling. She was 17, and she had practiced parallel parking 43 times in her mother's sedan. She knew the hand signals. She knew the proper following distance. She was ready. The fluorescent lights above her hummed in that particular frequency that exists only in government buildings, a sound that seems to vibrate somewhere behind the eyes. The plastic chair beneath her was the color of nothing, that institutional beige that defies memory. Around her, the waiting room sat empty, though when she'd arrived 20 minutes earlier, she could have sworn she'd seen other people. A woman with a toddler, an elderly man reading a newspaper. But now there was only Emily, and the clock on the wall, and the soft scratch of a pen from somewhere behind the frosted glass partition. She watched the clock. The second hand moved, but not quite right. It would tick forward, pause, tick forward twice in quick succession, then pause again. Emily told herself she was nervous, that anxiety did strange things to perception. Her driving test was scheduled for 9 o'clock. The clock showed 8:57, then 8:56, then 9:02. A door opened somewhere down the hallway. Footsteps approached, measured and unhurried, and then a man stood before her. He wore the standard examiner's uniform, khaki pants, a navy polo shirt with the DMV logo embroidered on the breast pocket. He held a clipboard pressed against his chest. His face was forgettable in the way that faces in dreams are forgettable, features that seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Emily Thorne," he said. It wasn't a question. She stood, smoothing her shirt, trying to project the confidence her driver's education teacher had assured her would help. "Yes, that's me. I'm ready for my test." The examiner said nothing. He turned and walked toward the door that led to the parking lot, and Emily followed, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. Outside, the fog had grown thicker. She could barely see the edge of the parking lot, and beyond it, the road dissolved into white nothingness. Her mother's car waited where she'd left it, a sensible silver sedan that had seen Emily through countless practice sessions. The examiner circled the vehicle slowly, making marks on his clipboard. Emily stood by the driver's door, waiting for the instruction to demonstrate the turn signals, the brake lights, the horn. But the instruction never came. The examiner simply opened the passenger door and sat down, his clipboard balanced on his knee, his pen already moving across the paper. Emily got in. She adjusted her mirrors carefully, first the rear view, then the side mirrors, narrating her actions the way she'd been taught, adjusting mirrors for visibility. Seatbelt fastened, checking that the parking brake is disengaged. She glanced at the examiner for acknowledgement, for the standard nod that meant she should proceed. He was writing. The pen moved across the clipboard in quick, precise strokes, but his eyes were fixed on her, unblinking. She realized she hadn't seen him blink since he'd first appeared in the waiting room. Should I start the route now?" she asked. The examiner said nothing, but his pen lifted from the clipboard and pointed forward, toward the fog-shrouded road. Emily pulled out of the parking lot with careful precision, signaling, even though there were no other cars in sight. The road stretched ahead of her, a 2-lane rural route that wound through farmland and forest. She knew this road. She'd driven it a dozen times with her mother in the passenger seat, practicing for this very moment. But in the fog, it felt different. The familiar landmarks, the old oak tree at the first curve, the Peterson farm with its red barn, the bridge over Miller Creek, none of them appeared when they should have. She drove in silence, maintaining the speed limit, checking her mirrors at regular intervals. Each time she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw the back seat behind her, empty. Just gray upholstery, and the edge of a seatbelt she'd never noticed before hanging at an odd angle. The examiner's pen never stopped moving. "Is there anything specific you'd like me to demonstrate?" Emily asked, her voice sounding strange in the quiet car. "A 3-point turn, or—" The pen stopped. The examiner's head turned toward her, with a smoothness that didn't seem quite human, a rotation of the neck that moved in perfect increments, like a machine adjusting its position. His eyes, she realized now that they weren't just unblinking. They were utterly still. No movement at all, not the tiny microsaccades that living eyes make constantly. They were fixed on her face like painted things. And then his head rotated back, and the pen resumed its scratching. Emily's hands tightened on the wheel. She checked the rearview mirror again, seeking the comfort of the familiar back seat, and felt her breath catch in her throat. The back seat was empty, but it was a different kind of empty than before. The gray upholstery was there, yes, but it was too far away. The interior of the car seemed to have stretched behind her, the back seat receding into a darkness that couldn't exist within the confines of a sedan. And in that darkness, at the very edge of visibility, something moved. Or rather, several somethings. Shapes that might have been seated, waiting, watching the back of her head. She tore her gaze away, fixed it on the road ahead. The fog was so thick now that she could barely see 20 feet in front of the car. She slowed, as she'd been taught, adjusting her speed for the conditions. "I'm reducing speed due to limited visibility," she said, her voice cracking. She was narrating for herself now, anchoring herself to normalcy through the ritual of proper driving procedure. The examiner's clipboard had slipped slightly, angled toward her just enough that she could see the top of the page. She knew she shouldn't look. She should keep her eyes on the road. But the need to see, to understand what he'd been writing this whole time, was overwhelming. She glanced down, just for a second. The page was covered in her name. Emily Thorne, written over and over, in handwriting that started neat at the top and grew increasingly frantic toward the bottom. Emily Thorne. Emily Thorne. Emily Thorne. The letters overlapping, pressing into one another, some entries so dark the pen had torn through the paper. And below her name, in columns, were words she couldn't quite read. They looked like evaluations, like the metrics of some assessment she didn't understand. Things like response to isolation, and pattern recognition under duress, and resistance to inevitable. At the bottom of the page, written larger than the rest, she saw a single phrase, suitable for continuation. Emily's foot pressed down on the brake, and the car rolled to a gentle stop in the middle of the empty road. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive, like something waiting. "What is this?" she whispered. "What are you testing?" The examiner turned to face her fully for the first time. His features were clear now, more clear than they had any right to be, and she realized with a sick lurch that she recognized them. The slope of the nose, the set of the jaw, the exact shade of the eyes. He looked like her father who had died when she was 7, her father who had taught her, in the months before his accident, how to pretend to steer while sitting in his lap. But the expression was wrong. The stillness was wrong. Everything was wrong. "Emily Thorne," the examiner said, and his voice was not her father's voice. "The test is complete." She looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The back seat was full now. Figures sat in rows that extended back into impossible distance, all of them watching her, all of them holding clipboards of their own. She understood then what she was being tested for. Not her ability to drive, her ability to see, to notice, to question. She had passed. And passing, she would later learn, was so much worse than failing. The fog lifted as suddenly as it had come. Emily found herself sitting in her mother's car in the DMV parking lot, the engine off, her hands still on the wheel. The passenger seat beside her was empty. In her lap lay a laminated card, still warm as though freshly printed, her driver's license. Her photo stared up at her, and her name was printed in clean block letters. But in the signature line, in handwriting she recognized as her own, though she had no memory of signing, were 2 words, "I remember." The strip mall sat at the edge of town, where the main road curved toward the highway, its storefronts arranged in a tired row of faded signage and empty units. A laundromat on one end, a tax preparation office in the middle, and there, wedged between a vacant space and a nail salon that never seemed to have customers, a new optometrist clinic. The sign in the window simply read, "Vision Center," in clean black letters, with a painted eye beneath that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it seem almost watchful. Margaret Chen had driven past this strip mall hundreds of times over her 73 years in this town, but she could not remember when the eye clinic had appeared. It must have been recent. These things happen gradually, she supposed. New businesses come and go. Still, when she'd called to schedule her appointment, the woman on the phone had spoken as though the clinic had been there for quite some time, as though Margaret simply hadn't been paying attention. Perhaps she hadn't been. Her vision had been deteriorating for months now, shapes softening at their edges, colors bleeding into one another like watercolors left in the rain. Her regular optometrist, Dr. Hendricks, had retired last spring, and she'd been putting off finding a replacement. But the headaches had grown worse, and reading had become difficult. and so she'd finally picked up the phone. The waiting room was small and immaculately clean. 3 chairs lined one wall, upholstered in that particular shade of medical gray that exists only in clinics and hospitals. A water cooler hummed in the corner. Magazines fanned across a low table, their covers slightly out of date. Margaret signed her name on a clipboard at the front desk, filling out forms that asked standard questions about her medical history, her current prescriptions, any family history of eye disease. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with a faint, rhythmic pulse that she felt more than heard. She was the only patient in the waiting room. She had been the only car in the parking lot. A door opened at the back of the room, and a woman in pale blue scrubs emerged, clipboard in hand. She smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mrs. Chen, we're ready for you." The examination room was smaller than Margaret expected, dominated by a large chair that reminded her of a dentist's seat, with a complex apparatus mounted on an adjustable arm beside it. The walls were bare, except for the standard eye chart, black letters descending in neat rows from E to increasingly illegible configurations. A clock on the wall showed 3:15, though Margaret was certain her appointment had been for 2. "Please, have a seat." The technician gestured toward the chair. "Dr. Marsh will be with you shortly. We'll start with some preliminary tests." Margaret settled into the chair, which was colder than she'd anticipated. The leather, or was it vinyl, pressing against her back with an almost clinical intimacy. The technician dimmed the lights and positioned the apparatus in front of Margaret's face, a binocular-like device with dozens of small lenses arranged in concentric circles. "Now," the technician said, her voice soft and measured, "I'm going to show you some images. Tell me what you see." The first images were simple: a house, a tree, a dog running across a field. Margaret named them easily, her voice steady in the quiet room. The lenses clicked and shifted, and the images continued. A birthday cake with candles, a sailboat on calm water, a woman holding an infant. "Very good," the technician murmured, making notes on her clipboard. "Now we'll begin the refraction test. I'll be changing lenses. Tell me when the image becomes clearer." Click. The room sharpened slightly, the edges of the eye chart coming into focus. Margaret read the letters aloud, descending through the rows until they blurred again. Click. Clearer still. She could see the individual threads in the technician's scrubs now, the fine lines around her eyes, the small mole beneath her left ear. Click. And something changed. In the corner of the room, where the wall met the ceiling, there was a figure. It stood perfectly still, its shape indistinct but undeniably present, like a shadow that had decided to exist in 3 dimensions. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Chen?" Margaret began, then stopped. The figure hadn't moved. It simply stood there, watching. "No, nothing. Continue." The technician made another note. Click. The figure in the corner grew clearer. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long for its body, its head tilted at an angle that suggested curiosity. Or hunger. Margaret couldn't tell. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the eye chart, but now she could see something else. Words, written on the wall in small, cramped handwriting that she was certain hadn't been there before. "She has been chosen." "Mrs. Chen, can you read the bottom line?" Margaret's mouth was dry. Yes. RPTEC. The letters felt wrong in her mouth, like she was speaking a language she didn't understand. Click. There were more figures now. 2 standing by the door, one seated in a chair that Margaret was certain hadn't existed a moment ago. They all watched her with that same patient, expectant silence. The words on the wall had multiplied, covering every surface in that cramped, urgent script. The examination continues. She sees now. She sees what was always there. "You're doing very well," the technician said, and Margaret realized that the woman's voice had changed. It was deeper now, resonant, as though coming from somewhere far away. Just a few more adjustments. Click. The room inverted. No, that wasn't right. The room remained the same, but Margaret's perspective had shifted, and she found herself looking down at her own body, still seated in the examination chair. Her hands rested on the armrests, her eyes open and staring straight ahead through the apparatus, her chest rising and falling with slow, mechanical breaths. She looked peaceful. She looked empty. Margaret tried to speak, but she had no mouth. She tried to move, but she had no body. She was simply a point of awareness floating near the ceiling, watching the scene unfold below her with a detachment that should have terrified her but instead filled her with a strange, cold calm. The figures in the room had turned to look up at her. Their faces were blank, smooth surfaces where features should have been, and yet Margaret could feel their attention like a physical weight. The words on the walls had changed again. She has passed. She sees clearly now. Mrs. Chen? The technician's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. How is your vision? Margaret considered the question. From up here, she could see everything. The examination room, the waiting area beyond, the strip mall parking lot, empty beneath the afternoon sun. And beyond that, stretching out in all directions, she could see the thin, dark threads that connected everything, the invisible architecture of something vast and patient and endlessly hungry, woven through the fabric of reality, like a spider's web through morning dew. She had always needed glasses. She had always struggled to see what was right in front of her. But now, finally, her vision was perfect. Below, her body smiled. When Margaret Chen walked out of the vision center 45 minutes later, she moved with a new sureness, her steps measured and precise. The woman at the front desk handed her a case containing her new glasses, simple wire frames, unremarkable in every way, and reminded her to schedule a follow-up appointment in 6 months. Of course, Margaret said, and her voice was calm, and her eyes were clear, and somewhere deep inside the hollow space where her awareness used to live, something else looked out at the world and found it satisfactory. The strip mall sat at the edge of town, its storefronts quiet in the fading light. A laundromat on one end, a tax preparation office in the middle, and there, wedged between a vacant space and a nail salon that never seemed to have customers, a vision center with a painted eye in the window. It watched the parking lot. It waited for the next appointment. The clock inside read 3:15, as it always had, as it always would, and the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless, patient hymn. The examination is complete. Rest now, if you can, and try not to wonder what you might have answered.